I'd like to call back to order the February 4th, 2020 meeting of the Pima County Board of Supervisors. We have several items regarding Stonegarden on our agenda. One of them was placed on there by Supervisor Christie from District 4. I'm going to ask Mr. Christie if it's okay we take these items all together. They are items 11, 15, and 16.
That's fine. Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate that. A lot of very good discussion.
Mr. Chairman?
Supervisor Miller, excuse me, I was going to make a comment, but go ahead.
You said items 11, 15, and 16. Are we going to address item 14 at the same time, or are we going to do that separately?
We can address item 14 at the same time, too.
Okay.
That's fine.
Thank you.
I apologize to everybody. I did make that error. So I appreciate everybody's comments, and I appreciate the respect that everybody was showing in the room. I look forward to a good discussion with the board. Supervisor Bronson.
I thought we were dealing with Supervisor Christie's first.
We're going to deal with all of these together.
Okay.
If you want to go ahead and comment, Mr. Christie, go ahead, please.
Just from a procedural standpoint, so everybody's on the same page, I'd like to ask Mr. Flagg for clarification on this particular item as outlined in the numerical sequence by the chairman. Is a formal motion required to allow for discussion, or can discussion be allowed followed by a formal motion?
Mr. Chairman, Supervisor Christie, under the parliamentary procedure rules, typically a motion and a second are required before debate occurs on the motion. That's not a requirement of state law. That's a parliamentary procedure question that I think the chairman would decide.
Mr. Chair,
and I think council's comments are correct. If we're going to have discussion on a specific motion, then we need to have a motion on the floor. If we want to have discussion about the item in general, that's perfectly permissible prior to making a motion.
So based on those two conveyances from Mr. Flagg and from the chairman, I would like to make a motion to accept the 2018 Stonegarden grants as stated in agenda items 15 and 16, and then added 11 and 12. Is that correct, the numbers?
No.
15 and
14, 15, 16, and item 11. I think that it would be best if we made individual motions on each one of these items, but we can have this discussion as we move
in
on.
my motion, I was just addressing 15 and 16, so I'll keep that in the motion to accept the 2018 Stonegarden grants as stated in agenda items 15 and 16, with the accompanying terms and conditions as outlined and highlighted in Sheriff Napier's memorandum dated December 17th, 2019, and the County Administrator's memorandum dated January 16th, 2020.
Thank you very much. Is there a second?
I'll second it for sake of discussion.
We have a motion and a second to approve items 15 and 16.
Mr. Chairman.
And ultimately item 11 as well. Supervisor Christie.
It's sometimes interesting that between the speakers and the board members, we do get some sort of agreement. I too have felt the agreement with some of the speakers in their summary of why are we having this discussion. Why are we back here again debating this? And I concur with that, but I think probably from a different perspective. I don't think it has been advisable or proper that we've had this discussion this long. These grants should have been accepted by this board a number of months ago. One of the things that we did in our office is just to look at the fact that these very similar Stonegarden grants have been automatically put on the consent agenda and accepted by this board for some 12 years. Yet in the last 2 years, we've been debating whether or not to accept them. And we just did a little math to figure out the time and energy that the county employees have spent on memorandum regarding the Stonegarden grants and CLEP-C and the amount of taxpayer money that has been devoted to these memorandum and research, everywhere from the county administrator to other board members and to members of the public. We have roughly close to 50, just under 50 memorandum since we've been discussing this. That is a huge amount of taxpayer time, money, and energy. So based on the fact that the sheriff has been working diligently, I believe, to find ways to make this grant as acceptable and as appropriate as he possibly can. He has worked diligently with community members, trying to gather input and information that can explain the necessity of accepting these grants, and he has worked tirelessly with the county board to try to reach some kind of accommodation where this grant can be accepted and would be accepted from Washington. And I think he's done that in his December 17th, 2019 memorandum. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to have Sheriff Napier address this board and make comments regarding his memorandum and the county administrator's accompanying memorandum of January 16th.
Very well. Sheriff Napier.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning in support of the Operation Stonegarden grant. As Supervisor Christie points out, I believe the Sheriff's Department has been very diligent trying to answer community concerns and work cooperatively with the county administrator and members of the board to try to find a path forward that would address community concerns, fiscal concerns, and provide us a path forward that is a compromise path forward, because compromise is clearly necessary. And I embrace that compromise. We've talked about humanitarian aid, and I've been very clear in my vocal support that the federal government needs to provide to Pima County humanitarian aid to deal with the humanitarian crisis that was created by immigration policies that we have to deal with. We have to provide a standard of care to people in our community, and it is right and proper that we have requested federal aid to help us with humanitarian aid. Unfortunately, that aid was denied under Operation Stonegarden funding. Operation Stonegarden is an operational grant. And while permissible and allowable under IB 436, which is a FEMA directive, to reallocate some of that Stonegarden funding toward humanitarian aid, it was kind of circumnavigated by House Bill 3401, which is specifically earmarked and funded to provide humanitarian aids to communities just like Pima County that are facing a humanitarian crisis. That bill was originally funded with $30 million. The first round of grants came from that, and I understand that there's at least $20 million still there up for the grab, and I would very much support Pima County pursuing those funds through a more appropriate venue, which is House Bill 3401. We have worked diligently to find a way to kind of wean ourselves from Stonegarden dependency. I have a very affirmative responsibility as your county sheriff to provide public safety in our county. To deny that there are transnational crime threats that come up from our border in the form of drug and human trafficking is simply to be intellectually dishonest. We are still interdicting records amounts of fentanyl, opiates, heroin, and methamphetamine. And we know that a large portion of this is coming up through the border. When I was a young police officer, if somebody interdicted 2 ounces of methamphetamine, that was considered a big deal. That was a big bust. People would slap you on the back and say, that was really good. You took some drugs off the street. We're now in 50 pounds, 90 pounds, 13,000 fentanyl pills in one seizure. I have to have the tools in my toolbox to be able to address these transnational crime threats while still being sympathetic, as I am to the activist community, who rightly have some concerns about federal entanglement with immigration laws. But the salient point here is that my deputies do not have the authority, nor will they on my watch, to actively enforce federal immigration law. That would make us a 287G department, which I've been very vocal that I think that is an entanglement we do not need. Nonetheless, Stonegarden provides me additional assets to put our deputies, let me underline that, our deputies, out in the rural areas of Pima County. Yes, we're in support of a federal mission out there, but we're also providing public safety services that are fundamentally necessary to keep Pima County safer. And I would argue that a lot of the drugs that we're interdicting are not residing in Pima County. The 13,000 fentanyl pills that we took off the street were not going to be consumed in Pima County. Those were going to result in overdoses in Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, New York, because these drugs were simply a conduit. I have to have the tools in my toolbox to address the very real humanitarian threat of human trafficking. Migrants are being victimized criminally, financially, and sexually as they come up through the border. We have to have the tools in our toolbox. I have to have the resources to do that. Our plan starts to divest us from dependency in federal funds through Stonegarden by realizing that we have an operational asset, meaning the Robles Junction Station, that I need funding to upfit. But the problem with that is I don't have the bodies. I don't have the funding currently. If this board awarded me the funding right now, it would take me about a year to get up and running out there. So I see Stonegarden funding and acceptance of this grant and the terms offered by the county administrator and collaborated with me as a bridge to get us to the point where we could, to some degree, separate ourselves from dependency on federal funding, which we have depended upon for more than a decade. This body affirmed multiple times that it saw the public safety benefit of this grant because you accepted it. You accepted it on the consent agenda. There are collateral costs associated with our acceptance of this grant. I would not deny that. I'm a bean counter by nature. I'm a frustrated accountant, I think, sometimes. There are collateral costs associated with our acceptance of this grant. I recognize that. Our plan does a lot to meter that, to ameliorate some of those fiscal concerns in a responsible way that still allows me the public safety tools that I need to address these transnational crime threats while addressing the fiscal concerns. But my friends, the things that we do not know and we cannot know is what is the cost of not doing this? What is the cost of not interdicting 13,000 fentanyl pills? What is the cost of not interdicting 90 pounds of methamphetamine? What is the cost of not rescuing a migrant in distress in the desert? What is the cost, as somebody pointed out, about all the bodies that we're recovering in the deserts of Pima County? As a father, a grandfather, and a humanitarian Christian, it pains me every time that I read in our daily force commander summary that my deputies once again have recovered human remains. Now, this may seem like an archaeological dig or something you might see in National Geographic. When I see the pictures of these bones, I see somebody's father, I see somebody's son, I see somebody's brother. I see a family in El Salvador or Guatemala or Honduras that will never know what happened to their family. This is a humanitarian crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis. And we need to be real about that. I need the resources necessary to address this very real threat that we face here in Pima County. So I either need these resources with Stonegarden funding, or this body needs to provide me additional resources so I can do the things that the voters of Pima County has entrusted me to do. And I believe very strongly that the suggestion that the adoption of Stonegarden funding will somehow turn the very brave and dedicated men and women of the Pima County Sheriff's Department into racist people, I reject that summarily. I've been in law enforcement since 1981. The people of Pima County, the Pima County deputies, the personnel that I work with on the Pima County Sheriff's Department are some of the finest people I have ever had the honor to work with. To suggest that the taking of overtime money so that I can deploy these resources into the rural areas of our county would somehow equate to them becoming rabid racist is offensive. These are the people, these are our neighbors. These aren't people that have been shipped in from somewhere else. They're our friends, our neighbors. They're our daughter's softball coach. These are our people. And to suggest that they would become racist simply by the adoption of overtime funds under Operation Stonegarden should offend us all. I'm offended being the leader of that organization that I have so much confidence in and so much pride in. So I ask you to give us the bridge, approve Stonegarden as conceptualized and supported by the county administrator and several on this board, and trust the Pima County deputy sheriffs to operate within their lane so that we can have this money to build a bridge to that point at which we can less entangle ourselves with federal funds and upfit the Robles Junction District Station with personnel and resources so that I may better police, autonomous from federal entanglements, the transnational crime threats that we face out there, provide better service to Sasabee, Arivaca, and the west parts of our county that are largely underserved simply because I don't have the resources. I'm policing an area of 9,000 square miles with about 400 deputies. I don't have free bodies. My deputies are running their tails off night after night after night, and we're struggling to simply staff this department to provide basic needs for this county because of the job market and other factors. It's just really hard for me to recruit now. I need your help, the community needs your help, public safety needs your help. We can operate within our lane. We are responsive to the needs of the community. We have a racial profiling policy now. We had none under any prior sheriff. We have a policy that specifically prohibits my deputies from staging themselves at Border Patrol checkpoints. We have a specific policy that prohibits deputies from asking about the immigration status of people who are victims of crime unless immigration status is an element of that crime. We have moved forward and been responsive to the community concerns. You are right 100%. The DARs that are part of the Operation Stonegarden tracking of data are wholly inadequate. When the community brought this to our attention, we investigated it. We now have a better data capture system than we ever had, so we can report back and be more transparent to the community. We are being responsive to these needs. I simply need the resources necessary to carry out my mandate to keep us safer. And that isn't about having disparate impact to brown people. That is not in my heart. It's not in what I want to be a part of or any such thing. But we have undeniable transnational crime threats that require a public safety response. I simply need the resources to be able to do those things. So I ask this body to have faith in your Pima County deputies, as I do, that they can operate within their lane, they can operate in an honorable and constitutional fashion, that we will continue to listen to the community as we have. That's not me standing up here and saying that. That's documentable facts that we have been responsive. I'm confident that the Sheriff's Department has done everything it can do to move this forward. And I implore upon this body to provide us this bridge of funding so that we can move forward. I think it is the right thing to do, and if I were not convinced that it was the right thing to do for my home, which is Pima County, I would not advise this body to adopt this. I'm committed to this because I believe in my heart, and as a law enforcement practitioner for more than 3 decades, this is the right thing to do. And I very much, Chairman Elias and all, I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I appreciate the sentiments of people who might disagree with me. Civil discourse is a very important element, and it is a two-way street. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. Supervisor Miller.
I have some questions for Sheriff Napier. Okay. I sent you not once but twice a request for some information regarding the memorandum of December 17th. I asked you about, you want to add, one of the proposals in here is to add 13 new personnel at a cost of $4 million is what you're estimating, and you have in your memo that the cost is $2.4 million because you're assuming you're going to get a grant from the federal government for straight time. This is from the December 19th memo, or December 17th, 2019 memorandum that you sent. And my question to you, isn't that considered, and if there's someone here that's an expert in grants, supplanting? And I sent that to both you and Mr. Huckleberry twice, and I never got a response to that question.
Chairman Elias, Supervisor Miller, thank you for that question. No, it's not. In this case, it would not be supplanting because it's technically allowed under the Operation Stonegarden grant. I'm unaware of any Stonegarden recipient that is, instead of using overtime, augmenting with straight time. I've asked them about this, and honestly, they don't know how that would function, but it is not supplanting under the terms of this grant.
Under the current grant, but if you got a grant for straight time, I believe that would be a potential consideration, would be supplanting, because you're actually funding these people, you're hiring them as a result of a grant, which is the very definition of supplanting.
Chairman Elias, Supervisor Miller, actually in this case, that would be for existing personnel. So it would be funding a portion of that person's salary with straight time. So it wouldn't be supplanting in this case because it's actually allowed under the terms of the grant. So I understand your concern about supplanting, but in this case, it would not apply.
But not on this existing grant. I'm talking about going forward, because you're talking about creating a new department and using federal funds to fund it permanently, because you said the cost in here would be roughly $2.4 million per year, and the actual cost is $4 million a year. So you're going to be using federal funding, is what you said in your memo, to fund part of the department. So you're expecting you only need to look for $2.4 million when the budget comes around.
Chairman Elias, Supervisor Miller, your point's well taken. I'm not sure that we could get straight time. It is technically allowable under the terms of the grant. What I would rather do, my personal preference is to simply provide the Sheriff's Department with the necessary funding so that we can upfit the Robles Junction station and provide better service to that gap between our Santa Vera district and our Ajo district, and thereby provide better service to Sassabee, Arivaca, and address those threats that are coming up from that region.
And the other question that I asked in that request was, what are the additional pension costs by adding these 13 new deputies? And I never got a response to that question either. I understand they're under a different tier. It's not going to be as expensive, but what are we expecting for the additional pension costs?
Chairman Elias, Supervisor Miller, that is would be hard for me to calculate. I would have to defer to Mr. Huckleberry on that, because a lot would depend on what tier those pension liabilities fell in. And without knowing where those personnel come from, I couldn't calculate that reasonably, because I simply don't know whether it'd be Tier 3 or Tier 1 employees. Clearly, the people that we would hire, the additional 13 bodies, would all be Tier 1 employees. The reallocated bodies to upfit Robles Junction might come from a blend of those. So it would be kind of a difficult math equation to determine.
Well, that was one of the things you referred to in here, is that you were going to not use any of the, I guess, Tier 1 employees. You were going to use the Tier 3 employees for this, according to your memorandum. So that brings up another question. Is there an issue with discriminating against deputies that have been here a long time versus deputies that are new, that you could say you can't do overtime but you can? I guess that would be a question for the county attorney to address. But I have a lot of questions about this, this proposal, and the fact that we're now going back to adding, and I mean, I look at the costs. You talk about you're going to need new vehicles, four-wheel drive vehicles. Yeah, we're going to end up at $5-6 million a year with this new department, adding it into the budget. And so I didn't get the analysis that I asked for. I would like that. I will be discussing this at the time of the budget. But I'm not willing to support this today because I didn't get the analysis I asked for. So the addition of this memorandum, the recommendations in here, there's a lot in here. And regarding the humanitarian aid, I spoke to Kirsten Sinema's office last August, and they had just gotten this bill approved with $30 million of additional funding. And I sent the information down to Mr. Huckleberry, and I know you've gotten, what, about $166,000 to date from that grant, and we've submitted $577,000 more. And what is the status on that? Have we received that?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, the status is that the second round invitations to make a proposal have just come out. If you recall, we had a lot of concerns about the initial round, and they held a listening session here in Tucson to hear from concerns, and most of those concerns came out of Maricopa County. We expressed ours, and most of them were the fact that this is a grant that it pays in arrears and only pays for a certain period of time, even though the law covers an 18-month period. We'll submit, based on the new proposal, the balance of what's due to the county in March 16th, or slightly before that, because that's the new deadline. And hopefully we will have some positive results out of that. We've been assured that we will. But again, you don't get a positive result until you get a grant award. And my guess is that'll come probably in later March of this year, we will be made whole for all of our expenditures up to December 31st. And my guess is that they're going to then have a third round of appropriations for the last 6 months, which then we have to submit for whatever expenses we continue to occur by operating Casa Alitas. So I think the humanitarian aid issue is, I think, fairly well in hand. I would anticipate we'll be fully reimbursed.
Thank you.
Supervisor Bronson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Sheriff Napier, you spoke about the DARs, the daily activity reports, not being adequate, and you mentioned something about data recapture, that you have a farm, or you had developed a farm, is that correct? For Stonegarden operations?
Chairman Lewis, Supervisor Bronson, that's correct. The DAR only captures that data that the federal government is interested in, and that is how we operated under the expenditure of those grant funds. The community correctly pointed out that that lacks transparency, and it lacks some of the data capture that they asked for. So as the sheriff of the county, I can mandate that our employees capture whatever data that we ask them to if they want to be deployed on overtime under this grant. So we develop, in cooperation with those concerns, a much more comprehensive form that will allow us to be more transparent and more responsive to the community's concerns with respect to our activity.
And you could make those available publicly? Those, should you capture that data?
Chairman Elias, Supervisor Bronson, absolutely that would be our intent, to report back to the board on a monthly basis, much in the same way that we're now reporting every time that we contact Border Patrol, which we previously did not do. And the public was right that they didn't have any perspective on how many times our department was contacting Border Patrol. And once we started capturing the data, we were pleased to find out that 85% of the time that we do contact Border Patrol, it's at the bequest of a migrant who's lost in distress. We've been working very cooperatively with No More Deaths to redefine our protocols so that when we get these calls, how can we better respond? How can we better leverage the assets in the operational area, that being Borstar and our search and rescue folks, to make sure that when somebody calls in distress that we can more effectively respond. So we're prepared to capture more data, but we have to be allowed to move forward.
Thank you. Okay, I would also comment that, and you can have a seat.
Thank you very much.
Sheriff Napier, thank you. Appreciate your time. This is not, the criticisms that have been leveled about Operation Stonegarden in its relation to fear in the community, and that it leads to some profiling that takes place. And I think that was very articulate, the way Dr. O'Leary brought that out in the discussion this morning. This is not an attack on our officers and saying that they're racist. That's absurd. You know, the truth is that our policy as a nation is one that's extremely problematic and has not been fixed within an entire generation of people who live here in the borderlands. An entire generation has lived under the yoke of this oppression that has ultimately come about because of our unwillingness to deal with immigration issues and resolve the problem. An entire generation. Ms. Garcia talked about 6 generations here. My family about the same. And I think about the generation of Eliases that have lived with this. And it pains me. But it's not about attacking our officers and saying that they're inherently racist. That's unfair. That's an unfair attack on community, ultimately. Nothing has changed about the 18 grant. And that's the motion that we have in front of us right now. I think it remains problematic. I think it continues to have a lack of transparency surrounding the true costs behind it. 6-for-1 in pension costs. The lack of willingness to pay indirect services, indirect costs. The lack of humanitarian aid that's involved in this. And Sheriff Napier always told us, well, if I'm not at the table, then we're on the menu. Well, apparently, we were at the table and we ate ourselves. That's what took place. And it's sad. And it's sad. And it's indicative of the fact that ultimately, right now, and it has been this way for a while, DHS is a rogue agency that really doesn't serve the interests of everybody in this country, certainly not of all the citizens. So, I'm very opposed to the motion. I just wanted to make those comments. And Sheriff Napier also in his discussion about this motion spoke about transparency and the fact that we've worked hard to be transparent. I think that's true, but the elimination of CLEPC was a very bad indication towards all of us. And replacing it with a committee that meets in private, well, we don't know what the discussion is, we don't know what the agenda is. We have an idea of who the members are, but that's not transparency, and that's not what our community needs to ultimately be able to deal with the dire consequences of the fear that's created in our community when we collaborate unnecessarily with the Border Patrol and CPP. So,
Mr. Chairman.
Supervisor Bronson, please.
I heard a lot of rhetoric today. It doesn't match the reality I see on the ground in District 3. Accepting, and the motion as currently framed, I do not find acceptable. Accepting the federal government's Operation Stonegarden grant, and it's a FEMA grant. It's not a Customs and Border Patrol grant. May I remind everybody, is a difficult policy decision. We've accepted it over time, but more recently, the vigorous public debate in opposition to the grant. It's clear that the grant hasn't changed nor adapted to today's border conditions. But there is one compelling policy reason to accept OPSG, the Stonegarden funds, and that is a new federal policy, the Migrant Protection Plan. In the last few years, we have seen increasing peaceful surrenders at the border for individuals seeking asylum in the U.S. Those individuals were treated humanely and afforded legal counsel, bedrock principles of our county and our country. But now with the more Migrant Protection Plan, things have changed. I believe that this plan will do nothing more than cause legal asylum seekers to be forced to return to the old, dangerous smuggling routes, to be victimized by drug cartels and those who profit from human smuggling. As a direct result of MPP, dangerous human smuggling, trafficking will emerge as a primary method of entry into the United States by those seeking asylum. History tells us the outcome of this activity means more deaths in the desert. Between 2010 and 2019, the remains of undocumented border crossers were recovered solely in District 3, the district I represent. These are foreign nationals who have died attempting to cross the southern desert from Sasabe on the Mexican border to the Ironwood National Forest on northern Pima County border, and through Ajo and Lukeville on the western border. May I remind my colleagues that all of the individuals who died attempting to cross the desert in southern Arizona perished in District 3, not in District 1, not in District 2, not in District 4, and not in District 5. The implementation of MPP now makes it even more imperative that more law enforcement is present in the western deserts of Pima County, not only for the interdiction of human and drug smuggling, but more importantly, for the rescue and the provision of life-saving aid. I assume my two Republicans, I think I'm incorrect, given Supervisor Miller's comments recently, would accept OPSG funding without any conditions, but I will not. In fact, I believe the conditions recommended by the county administrator fall short of ensuring the civil liberties of our citizens are fully protected if our law enforcement officials work in conjunction with federal agencies on border protection. In addition, it is clear, which is why I appreciate Sheriff Napier commitment to the data recapture reports, the monthly data recapture reports. In addition, it is clear by past analysis that accepting Stonegarden funding as is does not fully reimburse local taxpayers. That was my original concern with accepting Stonegarden funds, and that came as a result of actually reading the November 9th, 2017 OIG report regarding FEMA and CPB oversight of Operation Stonegarden and their recommendations that it needs improvement. I support the conditions certainly recommended by the county administrator in his recent memo and would like to add as an amendment, should the maker of the motion accept it, some more conditions. First, only the federal government can discuss a 2018 grant in 2020. That's interesting. It is clear if this grant is accepted, all utilization, this is a 2018 grant, must end June 30th, 2020, and that confines those expenditures to our normal fiscal year. Second, I believe condition H, which is that the county receive indirect expense reimbursement from any OPSG grant to the maximum extent possible. I believe that that needs to be condition B. We received it from Department of Justice grants in the past, and it's absurd that we cannot receive such from Homeland Security grants. As a condition, the principle is quite simple. Unless we are reimbursed to the maximum extent possible for our indirect expenses, there will be no overtime expenses incurred for the sheriff for OPSG. Next, it should be obvious that a grant program started nearly 15 years ago has not changed, is outdated, and requires federal policy revision. I would ask the board to call upon our congressional delegation to overhaul OPSG. In fact, the only published report from the Office of Inspector General calls it non-transparent and non-accountable. It's time to overhaul this grant. Federal OPSG policy requires legislative action and revision. Doing so will save federal and local taxpayers money. A simple solution, as well as cost savings for both federal and local taxpayers, is available by simply shifting reimbursement from overtime to straight time hours worked by local police agencies assisting the federal government in border security. Finally, I believe withholding humanitarian aid when it was suggested by federal department policy guideline documents coupled with a flimsy excuse for denial, as well as the runaround we've been given on indirect expense reimbursement, calls for an official review and investigation of the agencies involved in OPSG grant funding through the Office of the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security. We should ask that department to review the supplement their report of November 9th, 2017. And with that, I would like to amend the motion if the maker is so inclined.
Mr. Chairman, I cannot accept those amendments, particularly the ones quoting the overhaul of the legislative action. That would take years to conduct it to a satisfactory level that my colleague Supervisor Bronson is asking for. In the meantime, the opportunity and the window to accept the Stonegarden grants will have closed. You can only ask be asked so many times and then rejected so many times before you're stopped even being asked again. We've tried to massage these grant requests with all sorts of different variables in them. And we have to remember, we're not the ones that are giving the money. This is money coming from agencies designed to protect our border and to secure our people's safety along the border. And if we start doing things in a legislative realm, trying to completely redefine the formation of these grants, the time frame will take forever. We'll miss the opportunity, and it will be a travesty of public safety if we don't accept these Stonegarden grants today.
Mr. Chairman?
He's already turned it down, so there's no reason for you to comment unless you'd like to.
I have another proposal to amend the motion. In your motion, you included all of the sheriff's recommendations in that December 2019 memorandum. I could approve it today, the two grants, the one for the overtime and mileage and the other one for the equipment, if you leave off the inclusion of the rural law enforcement unit, because I did not get answers to my questions.
Mr. Chairman, just as a question, if those questions you're seeking were answered, particularly on the rural law enforcement piece, if they were explained to you in a satisfactory manner that was acceptable to you, would you accept that portion?
Right. I requested this information twice. I have not received it, and I want a detailed analysis of the questions that I asked, and if I get that at that point. But today I can approve the two grants, but I don't want the inclusion of the rural law enforcement unit, which I kind of think that should be discussed in the budget time anyway.
Mr. Chairman, I will accept the amended motion as presented by Supervisor Miller.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Supervisor
I
Bronson.
will not be supporting this motion. Again, we are not getting full cost reimbursement for our taxpayers. As Supervisor Christie rightly pointed out, the humanitarian aid is a federal responsibility. So is border protection, frankly. And unless we are fully compensated, and unless the terms of the grant change substantially as I outlined, I will not be able to support this motion.
Mr. Chairman?
Supervisor Miller?
I have one more question regarding the indirect expenses. Are we pursuing an improved rate from the federal government on indirect?
Mr. Huckleberry?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, yes, we are.
Don't we already have one in place, but we are working to amend it? Isn't that more correct?
No, we don't have one.
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, it is my belief we've had one in the past, but it's so far in the past that no one can remember it or find it.
So we haven't been adhering to it, but we have one in place.
We have had one for large federal appropriations in about 1981 and 82.
How old were you then, Steve?
We have not had
He was in his
one.
40s.
We have not had what the new vernacular is, a quote negotiated internal cost recovery or internal cost, and so it's negotiated.
Yeah.
And that's the new term they're using. It's going to be the same as our internal cost recovery figure we have today, which is 28.48%.
That's
but
correct.
you have to basically jump through their hoops to get them to agree.
I've been through a federal audit for rate packages before, and they will go through and they'll determine that some things are allowable and some aren't. You go through that whole negotiation. What is the time frame you're expecting?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, I've told our grants management staff to basically have it in place by, I hope, this June, beginning of this next fiscal year, so that it can actually be applied for grants that are coming up in the future. And, you know, again, part of our problem is we have a lot of federal agencies accepting indirect expense reimbursement de minimis, which means they just take a default 10%. Well, our real cost recovery is 28 point, the number I just said. So between now and then, we will hopefully get a negotiated rate with one agency that can be applied to all agencies, and then start recovering 28% from all of our future federal grants.
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you.
Could I add one more question, please?
Sure.
This is directed to the county administrator as well as the sheriff. With the motion before this board of accepting the 2018 Stonegarden grants, including Supervisor Miller's amendment, is it of your feeling and opinion and sense that this crafting of this request will be much more acceptable as well as obtainable?
Mr. Huckleberry?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Christie, I think one of the key issues is indirect expenses, and I don't believe that's included in this motion.
Sheriff Napier? You could stay there and comment. There's a microphone right there. Save you from getting up. Oh, you want to come up? Okay.
It's something hard to hear back there. Could you reframe the question so I can totally respond to it?
Basically, is it your feeling and sense that with these two memorandum and amended by Supervisor Miller that we stand a much better chance of getting these grants accepted?
Yes. Otherwise, I don't see a path forward for us at all. And I will strongly advocate for indirect cost, as I have been at the state and the national level. And I would say that I think part of the reason House Bill 3401 exists, Chairman Elias, is because we were at the table and we complained about the fact there was not a third rail of funding. And House Bill 3401 was funded with $30 million because sheriffs were back in Washington, D.C. saying we had a crisis that needed federal funding, and that is the appropriate stream to request humanitarian funding, and I think we will be successful in getting it from there.
So there's how many miles of border with Mexico?
About 2,000.
So 30 million, 2,000 miles. Okay, thank you.
I did make the funding decision, Mr. Chairman.
Call the question?
Mr. Chairman, just one more comment, if I may.
Sure.
I think everybody loses no matter how this vote goes down today. And what we're seeing at our state legislature, what a bill was introduced, House Bill 2468 yesterday, that basically would take away our board's authority when it comes to public safety grants, and would force us as a board to accept any grants coming from the federal government that related to public safety. So
Terrible policy.
that creates significant legal liability for the entire county and without the accountability. But again, I think however this vote comes out today, we all lose. We're going to see, should the grant not be accepted, we will see many more migrant deaths. And I just don't think this is the way to do business.
Mr. Chairman, could I comment on the statement?
Yes, please, sir.
We keep forgetting the obvious here, and we talk about the board having authority over the sheriff. The sheriff is a duly elected official, the chief law enforcement official in the county. He or she is responsible for the public safety of this county and should have sole discretion and authority to approve or not to approve, to accept or not to accept grants that relate directly to public safety. And we keep losing sight of that very important issue. He is a duly elected sheriff, and if this does not fit well with the the goals of the community or the desires of the community, there is a place called the ballot box that this can be changed, but not by trying to micromanage his department through this board action.
Mr. Chairman,
Okay. Supervisor Bronson, go ahead, please.
so I didn't realize the sheriff had taxing authority, because if we get these...
I didn't know that either. I thought that was our responsibility. Okay, so the item that we're considering right now is regarding item 11 on the agenda. So this is about the 18 grant, not items 14, 15, and 16 yet, okay?
No, wait, what are we doing?
Is that all right? So then,
No,
okay, then let's restate. Would you restate the motion? Because you made it.
I will restate the motion because I made it.
Very good.
I move to accept the 2018 Stonegarden grants as stated in agenda items number 15 and 16 with the accompanying terms and conditions as outlined and highlighted in Sheriff Napier's memorandum dated December 17th, 2019, and the County Administrator's memorandum dated January 16th, 2020, and I accepted the amendments to that motion as provided by Supervisor Miller.
I'll say, so you're including items 15 and 16?
That is correct.
And 14 as well?
no.
No, okay, 14 is separate. So this is 11, 15, and 16.
Just 15 and 16.
No,
Just 15 and 16.
15 and 16 is the meat of it.
Item 11 is where we started at. Is that correct, Supervisor Christie?
That is correct.
So that is a part of your motion as
That
well?
is a part of my motion.
Very good. Okay, roll call.
Supervisor Bronson?
No.
Supervisor Christie?
Yes.
Supervisor Miller?
Yes, with the exclusion of the Rural Law Enforcement Unit.
Supervisor Valadez?
No.
Chairman Elias?
No. Motion fails.